Hello, everyone. Welcome. If you are so inclined, jump into the chat and let us know where you are tuning in from. We're just going to give it a few minutes for a few more people to get logged in, and then we'll get started. All right. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started then. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Laura Hamilton. I want to welcome you to our Zoom virtual author talk with Kirsten and Christopher Shockey about their new book, The Big Book of Cider Making. They are going to be in conversation with Paul Clarke. Paul is the editor of Imbibe magazine and is an author himself. And they are going to chat for a bit about cider, and Kirsten and Christopher are going to drink it in front of us, which is really not fair, but we will, sort of vicariously enjoy it with them. We will take questions throughout the talk, so please use the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions. That makes it a little bit easier for me to keep track of them rather than trying to pick them out of the chat. But please feel free to use the chat to talk to each other. And we will go till about 6 o'clock. The book, of course, is available on the Book Larder website at booklarder.com, and you can support this talk by purchasing it from us, should you decide to do so. All right, so I am going to ask Paul and Christopher and Kirsten to join us and get started.
Hey.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, everyone. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming together to join us, and thank you to Christopher and Kirsten for joining us and with your cider. Of course, we're in Seattle, you're in Oregon, we're all in the lovely, slightly smoky Pacific Northwest, and we're all big fans of hard cider. And it's October, of course, so there couldn't really be a more appropriate time to dust off the apple press and sterilize a carboy because there's cider to be made. I want to go through a few different things in your book, and we also want to get some questions from the folks out there. But just to kind of kick things off, looking through the book, cider is in the midst of this new renaissance in its way. But the legacy of hard cider in the United States really predates the United States. It goes back for centuries. From your perspective, having made cider for so many years and worked with so many other cider makers, and having witnessed this new renewal in cider, how does the current cider boom fit into that American tradition, and how is it kind of forging its own path?
Well, I think there's a number of aspects. If you look at commercial cider by and large is pretty much 50% women-owned, 50% men-owned. So cider today is much more egalitarian from a gender perspective than either beer or wine are. I think the renaissance that you're talking about, one of them is breaking out of just the traditional version of what cider was, especially in England. English definition of cider, which is just from apples, finished dry. In the United States, we've always had a tradition of using what we had, being kind of scrappy about it, and not really always coloring inside the lines. And we see that right now in American cider, modern cider, kind of usually leads, I would say, a lot of the world in coming up with different innovations a little bit. So we often will take something and riff on it to create something else. And I think that's what we're seeing now. But that said, we're also seeing, there's a lot of amazing heirloom quality, stand up to the best English or French or ciders out there. So, it's a drink that you can really express. If you grew those apples, you can bring that all the way to the glass in a way that's really pretty cool.
Great. And, you bring up a really good point in terms of, kind of using what's available and this astounding breadth and diversity of apple varieties that you go into the book. And you have this great description about industrial apple growing today, that it's like putting diversity through a funnel. From a cider maker's perspective, what kind of opportunity does this sheer variety of apple varieties available to you and the contemporary traditions of cider making give you? What kind of opportunity, what kind of tool in the toolbox does it make for you?
Sure. So, especially in the Pacific Northwest, there's a positive and negative living in the Pacific Northwest. The positive is we grow a lot of apples in this region and a lot of dessert apples. The downside is that means there's a lot of great organic, cheap dessert apple juice to make cider from. So when you look at cider makers, there's a tendency to let go of using apples locally and going towards buying those big totes full of organic apple juice, dessert apple juice, and then making something out of that people can. So that's why there's a lot of black cherries and pineapples and things like that, because they're using a base juice that doesn't have a lot of character to it, but you can get great big volumes at a really good price for that. So you'll see ciders like that have the special green apple, things like that. And then you'll see ciders who are really trying to bring out the apples themselves. In the United States, we're now starting to grow some Spanish style apples, those really tart ones that make that Spanish style cider. So you see, especially in Oregon, I know there's a number of nurseries that have been propagating those out. We've got the traditional apple varieties that everybody calls to, but remember, a lot of those were just in somebody's yard in the 1700s and they made a great cider. It's not that they are a cider apple per se, it's just they've been a great cider apple for a couple hundred years. But the beautiful thing about an apple tree, if you've got an apple tree in your backyard and you plant those seeds, people may or may not know, you're not going to get that apple tree. You're going to get one of 10,000 or more types, 100,000 types, because they don't breed true. So really everyone's apple tree could be could spawn the next amazing cider apple. And so I think there's this treasure hunt that's on right now for people that are planting pippins out in their fields and just seeing what comes up, because someday we've got some that we've been planting and now they're 6, 7, 8 years old, and a couple of them are really good cider apples. Those are unnamed apples. They just didn't exist before. If they did, nobody named them, and now they're a cider apple. And so I think cider is interesting that way too, because you can come up with these apples that you find in a neighbor's yard that they say, oh, you don't want to use that one, it's a terrible apple. That's when you should light up and say, oh, great. If you can't eat it, we're going to drink it, because likely it means it's a great cider apple. And you can take a cutting from that and, create other apples that are exactly like that. So
we need to define a cider apple. So Christopher talked about dessert apples, and that's going to be the ones that we like to eat, right? And what you're used to seeing in the grocery store. So those tend to be on the sweet end, and all that sugar, of course, ferments. The sugar ferments into alcohol, so that's an important part of it. But to really get those flavors, it's nice to have tannins in the apples, and that's when you bite in an apple and your mouth tastes dry, or to have bitter flavors or sharp or sour flavors, and all of these things are in these different apples. And there's just so many varieties out there, either that people have grown, like Christopher said, and they're unnamed. I mean, we're doing a lot of that here because our climate is changing so much that we feel like these little wild trees that are scrappy and making it in this newer climate might be the ones that are going to make it, whereas our 100-year-old trees that are used to a whole different environment are starting to really suffer. So that's just kind of an interesting piece too, is to understand, that all these varieties have all these different flavors, and there are apple collectors. I mean, there's a place here in, I think we talk about Nick Botner in our book, and I think he's traded sticks, in the mail for years with growers all over the world, and has like 3,000 or 4,000 varieties of trees. So it's
Wow.
just, it's fascinating
Mhm.
because of the way apples breed.
Right. Well, when you look at this kind of abundance and these kinds of this range of options for you, when you're moving forward with making a cider, how much of it is intentional? How much of it is accidental in terms of, building a kind of framework for a cider off of, certain varieties that that this is kind of what it's going to do, versus incorporating some where you have no idea and this is going to be a big adventure for you. How do you personally balance it?
I think it's a really big personality question.
It is. It is. It's like, now Paul starts to uncover our brilliant question. So I would say that if you're a person who enjoys planning and wants to start out knowing what the answer is going to be, you can make cider that way. So you can start backwards with, I want a slightly oaky, little bit of effervescent, little bit sour, got some old world stuff coming through. You can work all the way backwards and find out what apples you want, and you can plan that thing out and get to that part in the end by being careful and going all along the way. We're more of a, what do we got, and let's juice it, let's press it, and then see what it comes out, and then say, oh well, that could really use that other one we've got in the carboy. Let's mix those two together and see. And so we're more of a by the seat of the pants kind of cider makers, I would say, and just kind of watch what happens and look at what comes out in the jar, in the bottles, and then mix and match as we go along. But whichever your personality is, exploratory or planning, you can get to a cider that's exactly what you want. For us, it's more of a, I wonder what that's going to taste like kind of people. Certainly you can do it the other way too.
Right.
So for example, this one we're drinking.
Right.
Now,
sorry.
I was just gonna say, this one's called Oaked Nancy because Nancy's our neighbor that lives on the farm across the way. And she just brought over last year all of her apples that she had in boxes and boxes and boxes and said, I don't drink, but if you make cider, I'll drink it. And so it was just probably 6 or 8 different kinds of apples. We kind of a traditional scrumpy. We put it all together. We juiced it. I gave her cases of bottles in the spring. She brought back cases of empty bottles in July and said, I drank every last one. And then this one, I had a little bit I saved and I really liked the taste. And so I put that in oak in barrels. And now we've got that in a bottle. I'll probably age that another, well, if there's any left, I'll age it another year. We're starting to get into it already. So,
Right. Well, we're talking about apples, and of course, you're talking about cider, talking about apples, but there's another big component in cider that, and throughout any kind of alcoholic beverage, basically, that doesn't get as much of the limelight, but very much plays a big role, and that's the yeast that comes into play. And one of the things I liked about the book, one of the things I loved about the book, is you really go down this path talking about the yeast and the other microorganisms that come into play. And I think for a lot of us, we're all kind of familiar with the role of yeast in the process. You've got sugar, yeast eats it, emits alcohol and carbon dioxide. But as you know, there are lots of kinds of yeast and other microorganisms that come into play. Who are your friends and who are your foes in this process when you're talking about making cider?
Well, yeast is definitely your friend. So you're managing, with any fermentation, you're basically, you start out with everybody on board. It doesn't matter what fermentation you're doing, whether it's vegetable or miso or cider or bread. They're all there if you're going kind of a wild style, right? And even if you're not going to go wild and you're going to pitch it, everybody starts out in the mix, all these microorganisms. And then you're setting up the environment for who you want. And if you're making alcohol, you're definitely trying to favor the yeast. And you're trying to give them the upper hand so that they outcompete the bacteria or the fungus or anybody else that might also be trying to eat the sugar. I think all fermentation I've come to realize is about who gets the sugar and how they get to convert it.
Yeah, there's so definitely no fungus that I know of is ever beneficial in a cider. Bacteria, the lactobacillus, the lactic acid bacteria, that can give you, they're on the apples and they will exist unless you sulfite them right away. And in the secondary fermentation, you can get what's called a malolactic fermentation, where that those lactic acid bacteria actually convert the acid from more of a malic to a lactic. And that kind of smooths the flavor. From our palates, what that would mean is it's less sharp and more of a mellow mouthfeel. So some people want that, some people don't. It happens sometimes just naturally. So I'd say bacteria has a little bit to play in it, but as you pointed out, definitely yeast. Beer makers can use their favorite beer yeast and see what happens. And we have a lot of beer makers with the new book. They're like, you know, I love a Pilsner. I've got my favorite yeast. Can I make a cider with it? We say, probably. You know, give it a shot and see what those yeasts do.
But traditionally, cider was made,
Right.
from yeasts that are on the apples, which starts at the blossom and goes the whole way through. And even in that, you've already got the acetic bacteria as well, which is vinegar. So that's one of the reasons you want to keep that oxygen off your cider, is because as soon as that oxygen's in there, that gives that acetic bacteria a chance to get going. And acetic bacteria doesn't consume the sugar. It's waiting for that alcohol, and it's going to consume that alcohol and turn it into acetic acid. And so that's why, alcohol production is usually done in an anaerobic environment.
Now, we talked earlier a little bit about the number of apple varieties, and you'd pointed out how you could very easily, buy the cheap commercial apple juice, from familiar table apples, dessert apples, and they'll give you a fairly, predictable kind of consistent product. Yeast is kind of the same way, I would imagine, where you can use a commercial yeast, commercial wine yeast, or your Pilsner yeast, as you were talking about earlier, or as Kirsten was saying, you could let nature take its course. What kinds of ranges are we talking about here, and why might you pick one over another?
So if you're starting out with a good juice or good apples, meaning they haven't been sprayed, there's likely a lot of microbiota on them. We say, give it a shot. See what you've got, because those just like for us, we all carry different microbiome around with us. Orchards are the same way. Some orchards, just even blocks that are just in the same farm, different blocks, will have different microbiota on them, including the yeasts. So that's the beauty of it. If you're a commercial wild yeast cider maker, you have to get used to the variability. So you said about, the variability. It could be that one year the yeast don't quite ferment all the sugar, so you leave a little bit of sugar in the bottle, which a lot of people like. It could be that some years those yeasts go a little too quickly, a little more quickly than normal. So as a cider maker, you kind of have to watch it. Whereas, as you said, with the pitched yeast, the temperature range, how long it's going to take to ferment out. It's very predictable with those pitched yeast, those commercial yeast. Wild yeast are a little bit different. They need a colder temperature typically, and they take longer. And the outcomes are a little more varied. But on the internet, you'll see things like wild yeast can only make a 3 to 4% cider, and that's not true. You can take wild yeast and ferment completely out. If you take commercial yeast, a commercial juice and inoculate it with wild yeast, you can get that all the way to dry, which is an 8% cider, and it's all done with wild yeast. So it just depends on the wild yeast. That's the beautiful thing about them. They're not professional drinkers. It's not like your college buddies that knew how to drink and could drink all night long. They're unpredictable drinkers, and they come out with an unpredictable cider in the end.
Right. And in terms of the flavor, the commercial yeast that you're pitching, typically it's going to give you something, if you control all of the variables, then you have a fairly clear idea of what your cider is going to taste like at the end. When you're using wild yeast, when you're relying on wild yeast, what kinds of new directions, flavor-wise, does this introduce? And what kinds of possibilities?
Wow. Flavor-wise, I think it opens up so much for you kind of discover your terroir of your own area. And I think what I had the most fun with in this book is really exploring the wild yeasts that are on flowers. The nectar is full of wild yeast, full of all kinds of microbes. And I learned that, for example, here in the Pacific Northwest, we have the dogwood. The one that I like so much, the wild yeasts. Anyway, so I go out into the woods different times of the year, and I will gather pine cones, or I will gather manzanita. That's the one that slipped my mind. So the manzanita flowers or whatever, and you need very few. We can do a whole gallon of cider with, perhaps one Pacific dogwood flower. And the manzanita, for example, or the myrtlewood flowers, for example, they just, you're using such a tiny bit, and you can use grocery store juice, and end up with these unique, fascinating ciders. So the manzanita has these honey, cinnamon, spice notes that you would never guess from that little sticky flower, right? And then sunflower petals, the flavor, that kind of nuttiness that is a sunflower seed, comes through a little bit in that cider. And I find it fascinating that you're not putting a bunch in there. It's not an infusion. I mean, we talk about infusing also, but it's not an infusion. You're just collecting yeast off of these blossoms, and you're getting these flavors that are very, very much with that flower. So like the bay laurel or myrtle wood, depending on where you are, you get this really interesting floral sort of bay flavor. It's not culinary like a bay leaf, but yet it kind of is, and so you're in the yeast, you're getting these flavors you wouldn't have known are out there in your garden all the time. I guess maybe it's what the bees taste. I don't know.
Maybe it's what the bees taste. I just want to point out before I get to my next question that we are taking questions from the crowd. So please stick your question in the little Q&A tab, and we'll make sure we get you taken care of. You had mentioned the concept of terroir in talking about yeast and biology just a moment ago. And, I think this is something that's fascinating when we look at the beverage world, that it's not just about a place where something is grown, but it's about the place where something is made as well. So for example, I think a lot of us are familiar with Belgian lambic beers, which are, wild yeast inoculate the beer, and you wind up with this very distinctive, very characteristic flavor of these style of Belgian beers. Or a couple of years ago, I was in Jamaica and visited rum distilleries where they basically use, they have muck pits. They're these big outdoor yeast cultivators, basically, and microorganism cultivators that go into the fermentation process and result in a very esoteric but also extremely distinctive characteristic in the rum. And so I love seeing this in cider. And what's happened in these other places that I just mentioned is it's given a very kind of distinct regional style to the beverages coming from these areas. In the book, you talk a little bit about some of these different areas and some of the different cider making traditions that we can look to for inspiration and for ideas. Can you give us ideas of some of the other places that we can look to for really vibrant cider making traditions that we could learn from?
Yeah, we visited in northern Spain. We visited the Basque and the Asturias regions, looking for that Spanish cider, because we talked to some cider experts and said, okay, so how do we recreate that Spanish cider? And they said, go there, taste it, and then you'll know. And so we went there and we tasted it, because as you know, as an author, the best thing about being an author is research. Like rum and Jamaica, that is good. You know exactly what we're talking about. So we went to Spain, and you know, and it's the difference between what you've read and when you're there. So what we'd read is, oh, in Spain, there's these big wooden vats. It's not very hygienic. That's why they're sour and that kind of thing. When we went there, we visited cider makers, and it looked just like a modern cidery here, even more state of the art. Everything was stainless from the very beginning, amazing hygiene. You know, they were doing that same thing, but to your point, the terroir of that orchard, you know, and what they've been doing, it's just in the air. And that's, you know, they have very tart apples. Their finishing process, they end up with that Spanish cider, but it's a beautiful, really technically complete cider. And so you get surprised. Be careful what you read, you know, about, you know, somebody's traditions, because it's maybe not what you would expect, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like sometimes, like when I was mentioning the Jamaican rum producers or the Belgian lambics, you know, on a certain level, when you hear that, you think, well, that doesn't sound clean. But no. It's part of the whole process, and it's, you know, it fits in very much along the lines of when we think of things like French cheese caves or Korean kimchi. It's these kinds of things where we're working together with microorganisms and working together with that kind of larger microenvironment to make something that is very distinctive and very special. I see the Q&A tab clicking up. Do we have any questions from the group?
We do. So we have a question from Tom, who says, a lot of our local apples are infested with apple maggot and codling moth larvae. Delicious. Some folks say to just crush them up with the apples. Others say to cut open suspect apples and discard infested ones. What are your thoughts on the subject?
It is a lot of work to try to find everything. We cut out anything where, you know, there's mold or big bruises, or, you know, like bruises that are starting to get consumed by the microbes already, but, you know, that kind of stuff. But as far as the moths or any codling moth worms or anything like that, it's just too time consuming. And if you're pressing, because how the juice is made is you're not using that whole apple, you're just crushing it and it's pressing that juice out. You're really, you know, not getting that much bug in there.
I would say when we start pressing, so we've just started, we picked the first pears. We've done one load of Gravensteins, our early apples. We picked pears this last a couple weeks ago. We're going to press tomorrow. We've done one batch of Perry, another, then we're going to stop picking the apples. In the beginning, it's more likely I'll start cutting into those and being more picky. By the end of the pressing run, I'm so tired, I will just crush. I don't even look inside, like Kirsten said, but you want to be careful of mold, because those mold spores, again, we said no fungus. So if there's any mold or bruising, that definitely, we always cut that away. But
yeah, that'll carry through.
Yeah, but I don't think from the, you know, if they're looking at, if it's a huge infestation, you might want to do that, but
just the random few here and there.
Yeah.
But also the other piece to that is ground falls. You know, traditionally ground falls were used for cider making. However, now it's really recommended that they're not, because things like E. coli are being able to live in more acidic environments than they used to be able to live in. And so we suggest not using ground falls, or if you're going to shake a tree, put down a tarp and know that it hasn't been sitting on the ground. And that's, again, just because as things have changed in, you know, the last decades, that's something that has to be watched out for more than in the past.
Great. Did we have another question?
We do. We have one more right now. And
Okay.
again, just use that Q&A button if you have questions for Kirsten and Christopher. Carly says, I'm considering making cider for the first time. Can you give me the quick rundown on what materials I would need, and if it's even possible to pull it off without a ton of prep time? What advice for the newbie who just has some old apple trees on her property?
Nice. So you just have to get those apples into juice. That's your biggest goal. Once you get there into a clean jar or a clean container, you likely already have the yeast that you need to make that cider. So your biggest struggle is just taking from whole apples into juice. County extension agencies sometimes have cider presses that they'll loan out or rent out.
We have a local brew shop that also rents one out. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll just have to do a little legwork. That's the easiest way.
Yep. We've worked with neighborhoods, have gotten together and all banded together $20, and you know, between all of them, they've bought a cider press, and they all get together and do cider making.
And a crusher.
And a crusher.
I don't want both.
Yeah.
And you can kind of hack it with, you know, trying to use a Cuisinart or something and chop them up. You really want a rough chop. You want something that kind of masticates them, and then you press that through. So there aren't really, we tried a lot of like blenders or things that people would have at home, and it just was a mess and not fun. So that's the first challenge, is just finding a way to make the apples you have into juice. Sometimes local cideries have days where they do that for folks. But once you're there, then it's easy.
Yeah.
Christopher says a jar or a gallon jug or a carboy, depending on how much you have. And if you want to go wild style, then you're just going to stick an airlock on it and wait. Keep it around that 55 to 60 degrees or so, and wait, and it'll start bubbling in a few days. And if you want to pitch it, then you're gonna take a little bit of that juice and sprinkle that yeast on there. Follow the instructions. You're gonna give it about 20 minutes for that yeast to hydrate. You're gonna pour that in. Same idea. Just put the airlock on it and wait. So we've got, in the book, we've got wonderful, let's see if we can find them, step by step. It shows you how to do.
Another thing to maybe know is this concept of sweating apples.
So there's all kinds of pictures.
So apples get softer and they're easier to process. So if you, the lady or the man, whoever has the apples, if you can pick them and then keep them someplace cooler for a while, until when you take your thumb and push on the apple, it leaves the thumbprint on the apple. Now you know that's developing all those sugars, and it's also easier to process. So if you're having to do it by hand, it'll be a much easier process than the hard apple if you wait until they've sweated a little bit. And that may make things a little bit simpler for you too.
Right. I'm really glad we had a question from a beginner, because I was wondering, you know, as you get into it, as for those who are first venturing down their own cider making path, are there regular potholes that everybody hits? You know, are some of the challenges and pitfalls that everybody hits the first time out, that just, you know, having your eyes open for the first experience, that you can help avoid some of those problems?
I feel like hygiene is one thing.
Personal?
Hygiene around your bottles and just your area, because especially people coming at this maybe from vegetable fermentation or some of the other places where you want things to be clean, but you're not really worried about sterilized. I think that's kind of one pitfall, is that you do really want to try to use a sanitizer, keep things pretty sanitized, like for your equipment. So there's no rinse sanitizers from brew shops that you can get. Another thing that works quite well is 80 proof alcohol in a spritz bottle, and just spraying down your tools and things like that to just kind of help. Again, you're favoring the yeast, you're not favoring everybody else, and trying to knock down a few of those. And I feel like that's a big one for folks.
Two more. If you're in a carboy and you know you've got your shoulders and then the neck comes up, I'll see people that they'll have something on there and they've only filled the carboy with as much juice as they had. So, you know, you still have like a third of the carboy's open in air. So I would say if you're pressing apples, just make sure that all your carboys are full up to the neck. You know, you want to leave a couple inches there at the top. But remember, oxygen is not your friend. If you're making vinegar, it is your friend. But if you're making cider, minimize the area, surface area that you have for oxygen. The last one is those little tops, you know, the airlocks that hold just a quarter cup of water. That quarter cup of water could ruin 8 gallons of cider below. You know, my back went out one year and I had a big 6-gallon demijohn, 2 of them, of apple cider. And I just didn't check my little airlocks for 4 weeks. And when I came back, they were dry. There was little, you know, those little fruit flies were just happily going down and into my cider. And I had 12 gallons of really nice apple cider vinegar, which is not what I expected to drink for the rest of the year. I was much healthier that year, but not as happy. So check those little airlocks, fill it up to the neck, and then.
Even if you're using, let's say you have 2 gallons, carboys come in 3 gallons. So use 2 1-gallon recycled juice jugs instead of filling a 3-gallon carboy part way. Or you're better off with more containers and less airspace.
And the 4th hint, if you're going to get juice at the store, look at the bottom and make sure it's preservative free. Because there's been people that have bought good juice, except for it had preservatives in it. They've brought it home, they've pitched and pitched and pitched, and nothing happens. They just have older and older juice that eventually molds. And it's because those preservatives, they fight all microbes. They don't know good for bad. They just know all microbes. And so they'll keep your yeast from actually growing in there. And so watch out for the preservatives that you see. I think those 4 are probably, watch out for those, and you're pretty much guaranteed to have something drinkable, I think.
Excellent, excellent. I believe there's another question from the floor.
There is. Thomas would like to know, I'm interested to hear that you made Gravenstein cider. My first attempt at cider making was Gravenstein with the champagne yeast, and the alcohol level would blow your head off. I'm down with that. It tasted great, but it wasn't worth the hangover. What yeast did you use?
So it's interesting. So it's probably, if it blew your head off, that means you had a really, remember Kirsten said sugar equals alcohol. So whatever level of sugar, I would say, Thomas, if you don't have one, get a hydrometer. They're really simple. You can get them at a brew shop, and they measure the specific gravity of the apple, the sugar content of the apple, which will tell you if you're going to have a session drinker, a sipper, or a blow your head off kind of experience. Usually sugars in apples will only go up to maybe 8-9% alcohol in the final product. And so the champagne yeast will definitely take you all the way through till dry. So all that sugar becomes alcohol if you leave it alone. So it could be, what makes me think is the whole hangover piece is sometimes there could be something else that's in there besides the juice. You know, that could be an infection of some kind that maybe gave it an off flavor, or you got some higher alcohols in there that, you know, those higher alcohols sometimes can give you a little bit of a headache. That's usually where those kind of things come from, is something like that. For example, if you make Applejack, the thing that really gives you that hard is that it's a higher alcohol. Fusel alcohols are going to give you that hit on your brain. So
the other thing is, we talk about in the book how to, you know, you take your specific gravity that kind of gives you from your juice in the beginning sort of what the potential is, right? Assuming everything goes. So if you take that specific gravity and it is showing that your sugars are super high on those Gravensteins or whatever, then we talk about in the book how you can, you know, how to add water or how to bring that level a little bit down. Or conversely, if you want to up, how to chapitalize it, how to add more sugar slowly to have it more of a wine level.
But Thomas, champagne yeast is a great one to use. I would say Gravensteins are over for this year unless you can buy boxes, but get on that wagon again, and next year try them again, because it's got a nice sugar and sour mix to Gravensteins, and they're early on, so you can start doing them for any of your other apples. So try it again. I think you'll hit a winner.
Great. I think there's another question.
Another audience member would like to know, you mentioned the pressing process being important. How is it different from using something like a masticating juicer?
So think of it as two steps. One is you're going to take it from apple to small chunks of apple. And the second is then you're going to press those chunks. And the only reason you chunk it in the beginning is that's easier to press than if you put whole apples in there and try to put a lot of pressure to squeeze the juice out. So you're really trying to grate or mill it and then press it. So a masticating juicer, it's just varying levels of how much you're grinding those apples up. And if you put it through some kind of juicer that really is juicing the whole apple, so you're not separating out the pomace from the juice, so it's not filtering, but everything's there, juice and apple. You're just going to have, it's going to be a likely, and then if you press that, you're going to get probably more juice. You're also going to get a lot of those pectins. Instead of being locked up in the cell walls of the apple chunks, they've already been released. So they're going to pass through into your juice. And so you're going to have a really cloudy juice, I would say, likely more than if you use kind of something that made more chunks. And so if you're okay with kind of a cloudy cider, you're fine. If you want a clear cider, then you might look at something called fining or using pectin enzymes, something that will clear out those pectins that are in your cider, because they're going to be suspended. All those little tiny cell walls are going to stay in the cider until you find those out somehow. That's the only really difference I would say with masticating juicer. It's just going to be a little more cloudy, but you can certainly do it.
Right. And, we talked about how you can get an astounding variety of flavors and characteristics out of a cider based on the apple varieties you're using, based on the types of yeast, it's commercial yeast, wild yeast, and so on. Not so long ago, I remember if somebody poured a cider for you and it kind of had like that little kind of whiff of barnyard to it, then it was like embarrassing. It was like, oh, I screwed this one up. But we've kind of learned that is actually, not only can that be something that is really complex and really nuanced and part of the cider making tradition, it's actually really good. Once you get a taste for it, it's like espresso or mushrooms or so many other things. Once you get a taste for it, you realize, man, there's a lot to be discovered there. What other kinds of attitude changes have you seen from people drinking cider, from people approaching cider over the course of the years that you've been making this?
So definitely people asking for funky, I think the first time I remember is a few years ago at a Mother Earth News conference. We were teaching cider making. Somebody said, I want to get my funky higher. How do I get funky? You're asking for funky. Wow. And then someone else said, yeah, that's what we're looking for. And I thought, okay, things are changing. Like you said, funky now is something. Mm-hmm. So I think there's that. I think there is appreciation for dry, true dry. Mm-hmm. So starting. So people are appreciating what would be a flat cider, what we consider to be a flat cider. And sometimes they're coming from the wine world. And so, I want a Chardonnay. So I'm going to have, a really well-balanced cider that's finished out flat, higher alcohols, maybe 10, 12% alcohols with a malolactic fermentation and an oak finish. By golly, you get into a Pinot Grillo or a Chardonnay kind of taste. And you're used to not having bubbles in your Chardonnay, so it makes perfect sense to also pour, from, a nice cider that's flat, quote unquote.
I think there's two things going on simultaneously, right? You've got the people that are interested in these flavors, they're interested in, what the apples are going to express or what all that is going to be. But at the same time, on the larger scale, we've talked to cider makers all over the country, and they've got like their small run in the back that they share with their friends and with people they know that are going to like it. But their bread and butter is still going to be, something that's sweet and something that's more in that wine cooler type flavor, because I think the larger population is still, loves a sweet cider, and that is starting to shift, and that's what's cool, because that's when people are going to really learn some things, and that's another thing that people coming to cider, often I hear, cider is just way too sweet for me, and it's like, whoa, wait, if it's actually fermented all the way through, there won't be any sugar. So you just need to either make your own or find those cider makers that are making dry ciders and that are allowing some of those flavors to come through, and not just, adding sugar at the end. And a lot of them don't want to, they want to do their craft in a different way, but they also have to keep the lights on. So it's kind of an interesting thing right now.
The other new thing that, before the pubs all closed down, we're really starting to see is co-fermenting. So taking beer and cider or wine and cider and mashing those things up and bringing the best of those both things together, which I think is really interesting. It makes some of the cider folks' heads just want to explode. But at the same time, it's pretty cool. We have a neighbor just up the road, and he did it. One of the best wineries in our valley, and he's one of the best cider makers, and they made something together, and it's really nice, and you're not quite sure which it is. Some days I drink it and I think the wine is taking precedence, and some days I think, nope, the cider has. And I think as it ages, maybe they're still trying to figure out that relationship. It's like a good marriage, as it goes on, people are taking kind of a dominant role and then a less dominant role. And so I think those are really fascinating. The co-ferments are really interesting.
I'm really glad you brought up co-ferments, because that is a fascinating direction that really I've only gotten into in the last year or so. But I think cider always kind of occupies, in our minds at least, we know cider is its own thing, but in our minds it kind of occupies a space that's partially occupied by beer and partially occupied by wine. Some of the things we've been talking about in terms of the fermentation and the yeast and the oil fermentation, in some ways that's the crossover with the wine world. But Kirsten, earlier you had brought up infusions, and when I'm looking at some of the things in the book, things like hopped cider or things like infused cider, there we're starting to see some of the overlap with the beer world in some ways, where you have these other flavors, other characteristics coming in. Could you explore that just a little bit for us? What are some of the avenues where beer drinkers can approach cider through that lens and find something that they're going to recognize and really like?
Well, I think the whole botanicals and alcohol anyway is already such an interesting synergy, and has been for so long, because in many cases alcohol way back, either the botanicals functioned either as part of making these medicinal or whatever, whether it was cider or wine or beer, and then especially with beer, right, hops came in and sort of took over all the other botanicals that had been traditionally used in order to preserve it, to make it last just a little longer. And so I think that with cider and with infusion, you really do get to play around in the place that was the beer world more. The ales and the beers were the ones that the botanicals were very strong in. So yeah, you ferment it. Usually we ferment it and add those infused flavors after we've already fermented the cider to wherever it's going to be, whether that's dry. So it comes in a secondary fermentation. Some of these things that you might infuse, like some of the flowers, they have sugars on their own. It might bring up another fermentation and maybe give you some sparkle. Some of them don't. A really interesting one is fir tips. Really delicious for about, I think it was about 3 months. And you get these, it's almost like a retsina. You get these really wonderful, young, piney flavors. It's citrusy, it's delicious. Again, for about 3 months. And then, all of these ferments are constantly changing as, the phenolics start developing and yeasts break down, and all of this thing is constantly going on in these bottles that we kind of think are done. Well, after about 6 months, those same piney infusions started having this, to me, forest floor flavor, which means musty. Christopher didn't taste it quite as strongly, but to me, I couldn't get over that it didn't taste moldy, yet there was no mold on the cider. It wasn't moldy, but there was something in that infusion that was now being brought out in that way. So infusions are really fun. Whereas hops, you know, you do at the same time and you're gonna get those citrusy or hoppy flavors depending on the variety of hops. And you can use, just like beer makers, you can choose fresh hops, you can choose dry hops, you can choose pelleted hops, and really have fun with those flavors.
Right, right. We've got a few more minutes left. We can take a couple more questions from the floor. And speaking of which, I believe we have one.
We do. Holly would like to know if you have any tips for sourcing fruit for people living in the city without any apple tree owning neighbors.
Who's going to go? Well, you'd be surprised how well you can do with grocery store juice. I mean, we did so much, and we went, you know, to, you know, the big supermarkets and just went across the shelves and tried, you know, Treetop and just, you know, the really not the beautiful organic stuff. And we just tried, and you would be surprised. You can make a decent cider if you have no apple trees available on your counter in a small space. And that's kind of fun because you can do it all the time. This time of year, often at farmers markets or kind of call around to some of these orchards, you can also get fresh pressed cider, and then you can do a cider that way. I think that's the...
Yeah, so both of those, you know, Holly, if you're in the springtime, I would say, you know, do the blossom yeast. So go capture some yeast on wild blossoms, and then get that culture, and then buy some commercial juice and make a cider, and you're going to get a wild cider that's just amazing this time of year. Like Kirsten said, as apple farmers as well, it's really scary how cheap apples are if we actually sold them to somebody else. So if you find if you know somebody that's growing apples, typically if you can find somebody that has a truck, or, you know, they'll be happy to sell them to you because they're going to get a little more money than they are putting them in the commercial system where it's just pennies on the pound for that. So I'd say find an apple farmer or somebody who's adventuresome, go out of the city to find somebody doing it. They'll bring back a lot of great apples. They'll probably give you a lot of varieties. They'll give you hints on how to use them. They'll be so happy that you're buying directly from them. So that's another way. And then that builds a relationship. So it's really interesting to know who grew your apples. And so if you can take it beyond just buying the juice to finding somebody that grows apples commercially and building a relationship, that's a nice way to do. And they're going to appreciate being able to sell them for a little bit more too. So.
Right, right. And we've been talking about apples this whole time, but of course, you know, once you get in the habit of doing this, and once you get a taste for making cider, you can venture outside of strictly apples as well. Because you mentioned Perry earlier. It's autumn. You know, quince is one of my favorite things to look for every autumn. So I was really excited to see quince in your book. What other kinds of things should people be keeping in mind once they get the cider bug and they start looking for things to play with as we go through the seasons?
I really like persimmons. It's a really nice, get some nice flavors, some residual sweetnesses that are really cool.
Stone fruits, cherries, peaches, plums, those are nice as well. Strawberries are a little bit tricky. You can get a burnt rubber taste pretty predictably with strawberries in the primary fermentation, but if you add the strawberries in that secondary, or especially if you juice them up, it's like strawberries are the only fruit I know of where consistently I have to be careful. All the other fruits. Remember, cider is just wine made of apples. So any fruit wine, you can use other fruits to make cider as well, like you said. The persimmons Kirsten talked about, we have American persimmons on the property. That's really nice because it kind of gives you that feeling of the tannic that you want in a really, you know, old heirloom cider. So persimmon cider is really nice. Quince are amazing. Getting them to give juice up. They look like, every time I process quince, I think these are really fat pears. This is going to go really well. And then we start the battle. And the quince are like, nope, no way, baby. And I'll let them go a month. And then they're as hard as bricks then too. So every quince cider, I feel like I earned every bottle.
Yeah.
I don't know how you get juice out of them, but I'm still looking for the.
I give up on the juice. I just chop them up and stick them in brandy and stick the jar away for a year, and then strain it off. And the thing is, it gives up the flavor to the brandy, but it also strips some of the color out of the brandy. Like if you're using an aged grape brandy, it's like carbon filtering it almost. But you have a beautiful infusion a year later. I just gave you my Thanksgiving secret. So that's what I bring to the Thanksgiving table. So I think we're almost out of time. Do we have any other questions from the floor?
We don't. But thank you so much, Paul and Kirsten and Christopher. Congratulations on your book, Kirsten and Christopher.
Yeah.
And I just hope that, at some point we'll get to drink that cider in person together in the not too distant future. And thank you everyone for attending this evening and listening in. Remember that you can pick up a copy of the book at booklarder.com, and we'd be very grateful to you if you're thinking of purchasing it, if you get it from us.
If you guys have signed little stickers.
We do. Oh yes, I should have mentioned that. Yes, they are in the current environment the next best thing to an actual signed copy. They will have a little book plate in with Christopher and Kirsten's signature on it. And so get your signed copy at Booklarder. So thank you so much, everyone. Good luck with all of your cider making adventures. I am so relieved to know that I could actually just go to the grocery store and buy cider and make it. And I've realized that probably all the times that I've taken like farmer's market cider from my fridge, that were like the bottle was expanding and like, maybe I had some there. Who knows? Yeah.
You're a cider maker, it turns out.
I know. Who knew? My gosh.
Hey, Paul,
Right,
thanks for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you everyone for watching. Happy cider making and have a lovely evening.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Good night.